Okay, I think we'll get started on our second part. Part of me loathes this kind of thing because usually you guys are just getting into it and answering questions, and then you listen to me. And sometimes I wonder if it'd be better for you just to answer questions the whole time. You like to hear me, I know that's the case, but I think that it is very important for you to wrestle with the text yourself. And I know sometimes it seems challenging, but that's part of what leads to growing. That's part of what helps us. That's part of what helps you get to know the text more, because you can listen to me for a long time, but it's better when it comes from inside of your heart. We might have to host like a Wednesday morning discussion club or something. Because some of you, I don't think, made it all the way to number 11. If you made it to number 11, I think you need to work on longer answers. Because some of the questions are much more like, how did you react to something? You read this, and we don't always give a lot of thought to what it would be like to be part of a crowd and see someone being stoned. I still think that would be relatively horrible, because you'd hear and see things that weren't very nice. Not part of what we would probably term civilized society today. And yet it wasn't all that uncommon in history that people were witnesses to executions of one kind or another. I mean, that was the Roman Colosseum. And Roman gladiatorial combat was not limited to one building in Rome. That most of the cities had a Colosseum where people fought to the death, probably every week. They didn't have sports teams. That was things that they went to watch. And I think it's really easy for us to say that we wouldn't have been a part of it now because we feel so differently. But if you were there, I don't think it would have been so easy to say no to. Like, it was something that people did. It was something that was exciting. It was something that you could see. This first question about Barnabas being labeled an apostle, I think, is an important one. One group used Google to help answer the question. And that's actually a really good thing. Like, that means that you're trying to look for resources that help you find an answer to it. I mean, that's the same thing that I do sometimes, is I'm typing along or working along when I'm writing notes, and I'm like, where on earth is this place? Oh, look up a map. Oh, okay. I wonder what it looks like. So then you try to find pictures of it, because at least landscapes probably haven't changed all that much from the time of Paul and Barnabas. But if you look up, or our book will say that being an apostle means one who is sent. And so Barnabas is one who is sent. So he's an apostle. And you could take that kind of explanation of it, but I don't think it's entirely the answer. Because he has a role in the text that isn't like everyone else who was sent. It doesn't call Luke an apostle. It doesn't call John Mark an apostle. It doesn't list probably some of the hundreds of others that were going out as missionaries. They were all sent. But Barnabas is given the title of being an apostle even in the liturgy. We celebrate the feast day of Saint Barnabas the Apostle. Maybe it's a memorial, I forget. I know Bartholomew's a feast day, but he's listed as an apostle in the liturgy. And it seems like he and Paul are the two that break the mold. Paul is a very unique case because Paul's writings end up as part of the New Testament. In fact, even, I don't know if it's the majority, but it's close, because the Gospels are a significant chunk. And then the letters of Paul are the other of the largest pieces of the New Testament. But if you have the four Gospels together and then you have Paul, you have most of the writings of the New Testament. You add in a couple letters of Peter and the letter of Jude and the letters of John and Revelation, and I think that's about it. I think that's the entire New Testament. And so not everyone has that kind of role. Now, Paul's role is tied to something that he does in particular. Does anyone want to venture a guess as to what is so unique about Paul? It talks about Peter being entrusted with the gospel to the Jews. Paul is entrusted with the gospel to the Gentiles. And so in the Roman Church, we celebrate them together on the 29th of June, the Solemnity of Saints Peter and Paul. They're considered to be, Pope St. Gregory the Great worked hard to make them into sort of the two founders of New Rome, because the pagan Roman city, the older history of Rome is that it was founded by, who knows their Star Trek?
Romulus and Remus.
Romulus and Remus. Star Trek, the Romulans I think the name comes from the guy who was considered to be a founder of Rome. But Paul and Peter are considered the new foundation of the city of Rome by Pope St. Gregory the Great, who sort of hammers it into the ground and makes two giant statues of them just to make sure that you know, because he wants there to be a Christian foundation that's stronger than the pagan one. So in a way, Paul is given that kind of role in the church that is unique to him. He talks about himself being one, I think, does he even say untimely born, or is that Shakespeare in one of his plays? But he uses a very similar phrase, that he was born like abnormally, because the other 12 were called, and then Judas fell away, and then they replace him with Matthias. And then Paul and Barnabas seem to be kind of added on. Although Barnabas doesn't have, as far as I know, I don't think we have any writings from him. They're not in the New Testament, and there might be some apocryphal works that are old that list something from Barnabas, but I don't know of any offhand.
I'm just sitting here thinking apostles would be appointed by God, right? And we had this discussion here, we're all disciples.
In one sense, yes. But the challenge here is that we're mixing language, and there's an equivocation going on. Because in a way you could say we're all disciples. In another way you could say we're all apostles because we're all sent. But if you mean apostle in a technical, official sense of the term, then we're not. But you can use the word in so many different ways. So in one sense, you could say Bishop John Fulda is our local apostle. That he's a bishop, he's part of this college of bishops he's given. But in another way, you could also say he's not an apostle, and it can be correct. You could say, anyone who's ever done a mission trip qualifies under one definition of being an apostle, but at the same time doesn't qualify under other definitions. And so there's a sense where you have these official roles in the church that are like by office, that are given by God, or at least instituted by him and mediated through human authority. So, for instance, I have an office in the church. Deacon Paul has an office in the church, a special role that's given. But in another way, if you use another sense of the word deacon, for instance, we should all be deacons. Because deacons, the word comes from service, and we should all be servants of the people around us. And so you have to be cognizant of the difference, that the scriptures aren't using terms in the technical way that we usually do later. The same thing happens in all kinds of fields. We have ways of talking about things that work, and everyone sort of uses them. And if you visit with really grouchy professors who have doctorates in it, they'll say, well, actually, it's not this, it's this. And it's like, yeah, that's great, but no one says that. So there is a sense that when you're talking about something, I think you want to try to work on the clarity of what are we speaking about. Because what you have to be careful of is there's a real pastoral dimension to this as well. You know, if you have a new believer, like someone who is just entering the church, they come into RCIA and they say, you know, God has called me to be an apostle. You can jump on them like, no, you're not called to be an apostle, and it sort of dampens the grace of God. One would say that's blowing out a fire that God has started. And if you don't know what they mean, it's a really dumb thing to say. Now, if they mean that they're called, you know, to get ordained a bishop tomorrow, you might have to say, let's wait on that. You need to work on it. But in another sense, you could say, yes, you are called to be an apostle. And if they start talking about, like, that means being sent to their friends or to the people around them, it's true. So it's really, really important to have in our minds the differences and the distinctions between technical offices and things that work. For example, one of the challenges that people will say is, can lay people give a blessing, or can women give a blessing? Most Catholics would say no. Most Catholics would say no. Blessings is something that priests and deacons do. But what's getting confused there is, can they give a blessing from office? No. Not in the same way that a priest does, or a deacon does, which is a blessing that comes from an office and the sacred character of ordination. But does that mean they can't give a blessing? No. It just works in a different way. And it's a different kind of thing. You know, if I got to meet Mother Teresa, I would ask for Mother Teresa's blessing. She'd probably frown at me and say, no, Father, I need your blessing. And I would say, well, that might be true. I still want yours. Because there's a sense that blessings might, in a lay person or in someone like Mother Teresa, a religious, not operate or work because of a sacred character that's given by ordination, but they could work because of her genuine holiness of life, that she is a God-bearer. You know, you could also call her a Theotokos. Now, is it the technical sense of what we mean that Mary is the mother of God and the Theotokos in the strong way? No. But is it true? Yes. And so I think we have to be very, very careful about this, because it's easy to get caught up in Catholic lingo. And if you have Protestant friends, if you have people around, if you have people that aren't on the inside, they'll ask you questions and you can really confuse them and say all kinds of things that actually aren't accurate. They work differently, and there's a lot of... It's like the difference between cutting with a dull knife and cutting with a sharp one. For lots of things, a dull knife works just fine and is probably better. I don't like to peel potatoes, for instance, with a sharp knife, because you're liable to cut your finger off, especially if they're diamond-edged knives, right? Like, those cut through practically anything. Like, you just wave it around and it goes through stuff that you shouldn't be able to cut. But I grew up cutting vegetables with relatively dull knives, and they work just fine. And it's kind of nice because if you slip a little bit and it hits your finger, it doesn't do anything. You might say, ow, but it doesn't break the skin, right? So sometimes it's funny because you're a chef and you're in the kitchen and it's like, do we have a dull knife in the place? Can we just find something that, isn't going to cut through my cutting board? So I think that these kind of things, this kind of sensibility is important in questions of like Paul and Barnabas. Are they apostles? Well, in one sense, they're not one of the 12, but in another sense, the liturgy calls them that, the New Testament calls them that, and if you want to argue with those things that are thousands of years old, good luck. So we have to be careful that we don't try and enforce technical definitions all the time. There is a time and a place where you do need to draw those distinctions, and they're important. But they're not always appropriate and they're not always helpful. And I think at the end of the day, it's far worse to take someone who's excited about something and shut them down than to really hammer in on the truth. Like a young kid, for instance, might ask you, do people become angels when they die? The answer is no, because angels and people are different. But what kids are usually asking is a different question. What are they usually asking?
Are you still alive?
Do people who die go to heaven? Because they've made this connection in their brain that, well, angels are with God in heaven, and so, like my grandma who died, if you tell this young kid that she doesn't become an angel, then they might think, well, she doesn't go to heaven. And that's, you don't want to say that. That can be very, very heartbreaking for a child. So if you're going to say that they don't become an angel, you darn well better explain why, and that people still go to heaven, and angels and people are different sorts of creatures, because we have bodies and angels don't. But in one sense, what the kid is asking is far more important than the technical sense of the word. Right? And that can feel like you're not answering a question, but those kind of things are important. All right. So, introducing our text. After all that, the narrative is interesting because it is relatively terse. Why do you think I would say that? Why is the narrative, terse means like short and matter of fact. Why would we say that about it?
Kind of gives the bare details. It doesn't flush things out.
It doesn't flesh things out very much. In chapter 14, it tells the end of Paul and Barnabas' journey, and then they sail back to Antioch, right? Anyone remember how long we think this journey took? 18 months to 2 years. You don't sort of get that impression from the text. It's like, well, they were here, and then they went there, and then they went there, and then they went home. Like if you tell people about your adventure, they might talk about being in some different places, and you sort of assume, well, maybe it took a week or 2 weeks, but you don't think, oh, you were away for 2 years. The text doesn't give us all kinds of things. I mean, did Paul and Barnabas preach once in Iconium and the people started hating them and kicked them out? Probably not. It says that many believed them for a while and the tensions don't arise until later. Maybe Paul was a little bit belligerent and a good debater. Sometimes it's happened in history. The Protestants called St. Robert Bellarmine the demon of Rome, and they disliked debates with him because he didn't lose very much. and they were upset. And so they're like, well, we're just not going to talk to you because you tell us that we're wrong all the time and then prove yourself right. So there's a lot that isn't in the story. It doesn't talk about their emotions. It doesn't talk about what's going on in their heads. I wish it talked more about Jesus. Like, when they prayed for people, were there ever explosions of light? Was there an earthquake? There's sure earthquakes when they get arrested and put in jail. Like, hey, Paul, let's try arresting you. See if we have an earthquake. So there's all kinds of pieces of the story that aren't being told. And the narrative, if you're following along with it, is just sort of like, well, these things happened quickly. They may have taken months. They probably didn't leave places right away. And it doesn't even tell us what they said in a lot of cases. It would be fascinating to know, what were all of Paul's speeches about? Did he ever take a day off? What did he like to eat? Did he eat anything? Where did he stay? What kind of beds do they sleep on? See, these are good questions to ask. Like, what kind of beds do they sleep on in first century Jewish communities? I have no idea, but that would be kind of interesting to know, wouldn't it? Because I guarantee you they don't have your Sealy comfort rest, pillow top, 15-inch mattress made out of layered gold that you rest on and float on clouds. Probably not in first century Turkey. Maybe they sleep on turkey feathers. But it's like, I genuinely wonder what they did. How often do Paul and Barnabas work? Were there anyone that's like, okay, you guys are nice, but it's time to leave. Like, I want my house back. See you later. Yep, we're disciples. You baptized us. You prayed for us. Now it's time for you to move on to that town. Did they wander around the countryside? Probably, because towns weren't all that large. I mean, nothing in the ancient world is the physical size of the city of Fargo. In the ancient world, the size of the city of Fargo would probably have 10 million people in it. I mean, we just don't have a concept of how big and how spread out some of our stuff is. And they lived in a very different era. So Paul and Barnabas, I think in our last place, they got thrown out of Lystra. Where is Lystra next? Oh, nope, Lystra's next. They got thrown out of another place. Do you remember what it is? Iconium? Nope, they go to Iconium at the beginning of 14. But that's a good answer. You're on the right track. Antioch of Pisidia. Vicky got it. Pisidian Antioch. I'm not sure why more of you aren't asking her to sit at your table. Like, hey. Some of you have good answers. So they go to Iconium from Antioch. And remember, this is a journey, I think it was of like 60 miles or 80 miles, which is days. And they go there, and they go back to the Jewish synagogue, and it talks about many people believing them. Many, they're called brothers. They preached to the brothers at Iconium. Maybe there were some Christians already. Maybe they were welcomed by people. There is a sense of Jewish kinship bonds. So the Jews, I was listening to something that was talking about world religions, and it said there's only about 15 million Jewish people today. I thought, that's not very many. There's something like 2 billion-ish Christians. I'd say probably significantly less than that, because lots of people call themselves Christian and haven't been to church in decades. But, there's 1.5 billion, give or take, Muslims, 1.75 billion, and then there's only 15 million Jews. And so there is a sense of Jewish camaraderie that's old. that they're Jews, they live, they go to synagogue, they do Jewish things, and it probably wasn't this monstrous group of people. Paul is preaching in the synagogue at Iconium, and if you're like me, you sort of imagine something like the size of Holy Spirit Church, or, like a big church that he preaches in. Probably wasn't. It probably was smaller than this room we're in now. It's not Paul is preaching to 10,000 people at a time. Jesus probably didn't even do that. That Paul, the synagogue was probably small, maybe a few hundred, maybe smaller than that. Some of these places could be a synagogue of 50 or 75 or 100, right? You don't necessarily, I don't know about you, but when I imagine some of these things, I just imagine them to be much bigger places, at least Holy Spirit size, but they probably weren't. They're small. And that too, another great thing to look up is, do they have any ruins of first century synagogues in modern day Turkey? In some of these places, you can ask a search engine and see what you find, because there might be some. Even if you got a 2nd or 3rd century synagogue, they're probably not that different in size, and you could see some of it. I wonder how big it was. Because we have all of these impressions. There was one place we went in the Holy Land that actually was a newer hotel. Well, the hotel wasn't built yet, but this pilgrimage center was built, and they had built some chapels, but then downstairs in the pilgrimage center, they had done an excavation, and they found an area of this town where the synagogue was, and they basically rebuilt it on the same dimensions and what they think it looked like. And it wasn't all that big, and they left part of the road that was in the town, that's part of the ruins, a road that Jesus probably walked on, that went through the middle of the synagogue, or maybe it was on the outside. I forget where the road was, but it was close by. You could see part of it. And it was just interesting, because you're in this basement room, but you were essentially sitting in a first century synagogue. Now, there was one difference, and it was really interesting, that on the wall was this giant painting of a hand reaching out to touch the tassel of a garment. And it was it's an image that would be very familiar if you were talking to a first century Jew, because people did that for rabbis. Rabbis wore tassels on their garments, and people would reach out and touch them. But if you're a Christian, you also know that it's from the story of the woman with the hemorrhage who reaches out and touches the garment of Jesus. But they put it in the synagogue as kind of this way of curiosity, of showing something that would have applications to Christians, but also would have applications to Jewish people. But it was a lot smaller than we were expecting. In another part of the ruins, they actually had uncovered the old synagogue, and it was strange because the floor was all wavy, but there was a mosaic where they take little pieces of stone and they embed them in something and then put a sealant or something to glue them down, and you could walk on it, but you had to really watch your step, because by the time that synagogue was no longer used, there was massive indentations where people would usually stand, and the stones were worn smooth, and the walls weren't there. It was just the ground stuff. But, it was interesting. And it was probably, I think, that synagogue in this town. The town was called Magdala. It's where Mary Magdalene was probably from. It was a port that they used to ship fish off to Rome. They would catch fish in the Sea of Galilee and ship them off to Rome. They were a kind of tilapia that they still call St. Peter's fish if you go to the Sea of Galilee. But the synagogue was probably smaller than these 4 tables, than this little section over here. And that would be a synagogue like Jesus preached in. And, again, I just imagine things being much bigger, like when Jesus preaches at a synagogue that it's, hundreds or thousands of people, and it may have been 50. Like you could probably see his eyeballs. Which is different. I mean, it's just a different impression. So that, I think, is one of these cultural shifts that we have to have in mind, and we have to explore, because I don't know that much about first century life in Greek Turkey. Those are the kinds of things where it's like, I wonder what all this was like. What did they eat? What kinds of fruits and vegetables did they have? Those, to me, help flesh out the story and help you get an impression. Like they probably ate a lot of dates. How many of you have seen a date tree? A few. If you've been to Israel, you've seen a lot of them. They grow on palm trees. But they, most of us don't eat dates all that often. Some people made date cookies, and those became common in this area. But, again, it would be a relatively interesting thing. See, if I was more on the ball, I could look up some of these things and then bring examples of them to share with you.
In that period, wasn't the Jewish part of population more dominant than any of the others?
Was the Jewish part of the population more dominant than the others?
Because we had all the temples and synagogues and they were dealing with.
I think that if you were talking about villages in Israel, specifically in the region of Judea, the Jews were probably the majority of towns. Practicing Jews were probably the majority of towns. They weren't all part of the same group, but they were probably the majority of towns. I think it's extremely unlikely that they would have been in the majority in like Iconium in Turkey. It was probably a small minority population in a much larger city. Now, was it bigger than any individual temple? I don't know. Like, I even wonder, how many temples did they have? What did they do with them? I mean, because I don't know that much about first century Greek religion. And in some ways, I would argue probably neither do you. Now, we know the names of some of the gods. That's true. But how did they worship them? What did they pray? I don't know. And people at this time were actually quite religious. This is before the advent of science, and so religion was important. Because if your home got hit by lightning and mine didn't, it was probably because I prayed to this God and you didn't. And it's your fault. That was their explanation for all sorts of things. Lots of natural forces were very, very scary and very, significant, and they were praying to gods all the time. But I wonder what they did. Now Greek communities would have a tradition of something else. Anyone know what a Greek tradition would be that they're probably encountering? Athens is associated with it.